We have the second round, second session of our considerations. And our first speaker here is Dr. Thorsten Jelinek. Okay, please.
No, it's working. Great. Dear Chair, thank you very much for the invitation and the great opportunity. I fully agree. This discussion is a rare opportunity in Europe, probably a rare opportunity also in the US to talk about. I myself had the chance to speak also at the Belt and Road Forum 2 weeks ago, both at the forum itself and at the 5th Think Tank Summit, and focus particularly on the sustainable development piece. So the question raised before from one of the colleagues from the DOC Institute, I think I can say something about that. I also had the opportunity to meet with the Commissioner Katainen, the European Commissioner Katainen, the German Minister of the Economy, Tsipras, and had a very private discussion about the European perspective. But now I would just focus really on the environmental elements and also on the sustainability piece of the Belt and Road Initiative. So we've heard basically on a positive side that the new Silk Roads, as some people say, it's not just one road or one belt, has the potential really to instigate a tectonic shift in the global order towards a new multilateralism. And here the multilateralism is not a Marshall Plan. I fully agree, because the Marshall Plan was post-Second World War. So this initiative, even though there are a lot of contingent regions in the world, but this is not a post-World War plan. So it's a plan made at times of global peace. So that's, I think, is very important to highlight, and I think it's also very important for the Chinese to highlight. And it's also a post-Bretton Woods initiative, so it's really a departure from that. The strategic construction of ports, long-distance railway tracks, of industrial infrastructure will shift trade routes from the sea to land, which is quite revolutionary. It will shift from sea to land, maybe, primarily, and also create new markets and rise the countries along the new Silk Road, especially within Asia, and of course beyond, also including the so-called third countries. The Belt and Road Initiative will connect not only distant countries. You know, when we are here in Germany and the train comes to Duisburg, which takes 3,000 kilometers as opposed to 14,000 kilometers, that's a big advantage. But it will primarily actually connect neighbors economically, and that's how it also used to be at the ancient Silk Road. Definitely, China is willing to share its immense financial and industrial resources, as well as its own experience of 4 decades of reform and opening up, and I think that was very successful, and will be able to secure its own long-term development. I think that's the win-win. Of course, China, as we have seen, has a lot of demand of natural resources. China needs new markets. The Chinese economy and the Chinese population is aging. It needs also to reshuffle those labor markets. So there are many challenges, and I think the Belt and Road also serves the interest, but in a win-win situation, serves the interest of China as well. So like in Davos at the World Economic Forum earlier this year, where I also could see President Xi, he referred to the ancient Silk Road to highlight the historical foundation of the BRI and to indicate that cross-country trade is an inherent human activity. So it's basically, in a way, non-ideological, even though today in a global capitalism there is nothing like non-ideological, but at least it is not something to impose to others. So there is an inherent tendency of people to trade across borders. And he makes very consciously, or China makes very consciously, that link to the ancient Silk Road. Why? Because until recently, the Western world has focused on the BRIC countries as a collective source of new markets and future growth. But this group of countries, as you know, Brazil, Russia, India, China. And then there are the missed countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, South Africa, and Turkey. But those countries are basically a collective source of new markets and future growth. But these are an abstract collection of economies without significant historical connections. So, and today when we look at the Belt and Road, or when we look at those BRIC countries, what they bring together is basically comparable economic data, abstract data. You know, the almost a fantasy. There is prolonged growth for the West, new markets to capture. That was probably the view the last 10 years, and it has probably also stopped now. But in contrast, the New Silk Road stretches basically along countries that comprise regions with a shared history and long-term historical connection. So it's not an abstract economic group of countries. These are ancient connections of economic, cultural, and religious exchange. And most staggering actually at the Belt and Road Forum for me was also at the think tank summit that most people were interested in the people-to-people exchange, the people-to-people component. Dr. Yakunin, you mentioned it, the infrastructure needs to be built by and for people. And here there was a big interest, and I think there's a big emphasis on that. And so these historical connections, of course, of the ancient Silk Road, they were not always peaceful. So there was exchange, but they were not always peaceful in ancient times. But if you compare with the rise of Europe from the 15th century, that was much more violent, as we know, eventually led to the First and Second World War. And so there's no doubt that this link is not just for President Xi to say that the Belt and Road was not authorized by the Chinese government, but also say there is a natural link, there is something which is probably more sustainable to build it along that corridors and those tracks than to have an arbitrary selection of growth countries as the BRICS were. The second important thing is when you think about global sustainable development here is that the Belt and Road Initiative has the potential to become the platform for implementing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. So there was a question from earlier about the climate change, and I think here a global platform is emerging which can actually tackle that. All Belt and Road partner countries so far have committed to these goals. So independently, you know, what happened by the UN. They're already committed to the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. China and another 146 countries have also ratified the Paris Agreement on climate change, which we see in the news. The US intends to quit again. But China pledged to stay and to stick to the Paris Agreement, which is very important. So basically, when you look at it, and we heard from the previous speakers that the Belt and Road Initiative is primarily an infrastructure initiative, and with 1 trillion worth of infrastructure investment in Africa, in Asia, of course, and in Europe. The challengers, as we heard also from the colleague next to me, that the infrastructure basically consumes most natural resources and accounts for the large proportion of global CO2 emission. So it's actually when India and China, only those countries, not the Belt, all the Belt and Road countries, consume infrastructure as the West have done until 2050, we would double CO2 emission. So we basically double CO2 emission only when China and India consumes. We're not talking about Southeast Asia, Eurasia, etc. So it doesn't work. It will not go. And I think when I saw all the demand for natural resources, it's pretty frightening. So there needs to be really, or the Chinese government really needs to mean it and implement it with a Belt and Road strategy. So the problem is also with the infrastructure. It's the least innovative industry. Infrastructure is the least innovative industry. Of course, if you build something, it lasts for 20, 30 years usually. In Germany, it should last for 100 years. Not anymore. So and that's the reason why innovation is also very slow in that piece. However, the good news is that based with today's innovation or based today's technology, 50% of CO2 emission could be reduced in the infrastructure sector. Also important, if you produce 1 ton of steel, which is a big ingredient of infrastructure projects, you produce up to 2 tons of CO2. So it depends how efficient you are. So that's really the big challenge. In addition to security challenges, in addition to the dislocation of people because of infrastructure buildings. China has this national revival strategy to build a beautiful China. Basically, China, however, committed to combating pollution. So environment protection is an integral part of the new 5-year plan. And during the Belt and Road Forum, President Xi emphasized the need for, quote, a way of life and work that is green, low carbon, circular and sustainable. And also at the Belt and Road Forum, the UN EP, the UN Environmental Program, and the Chinese Ministry of Environmental Protection announced the launch of an international coalition for green development on the Belt and Road. So I think that's a very good signal to really have sustainability, environmental sustainability, as an integral part of that. And you see also China itself has an immense pollution challenge. But we also heard on the other side that China was the biggest investor in solar energy, had much more investment than Europe and the US together in 2015. So in India, also mentioned here, India runs actually, yesterday I had the chance to meet Prime Minister Modi and the Chancellor Merkel, and Prime Minister mentioned that China runs the biggest solar energy project aiming at 100 gigawatt for the next 10 years. So it's very impressive, I think, and those countries can really, and I hope that India will join, probably from the Chinese perspective, also the Belt and Road Initiative. Here also different views on that. Finally, I believe, and that was also the impression of many participants at the Belt and Road Forum, that this initiative signals a departure from the old US-dominated world order. So the West basically has, if you see, and we spoke about the European perspective, the West and Europe has largely perceived China's tremendous soft power approach. This is what it is, right? This is a soft power approach China is having here with a lot of skepticism. So the Commissioner Katainen, basically, but also Minister Tsipras, they were pretty critical, and also Europe refused to sign the MOU. You know, that's where we are, and I think in that respect, US probably made a much better, but with a lower rank participation, but a better outreach probably. So this shows actually the Belt and Road. When we say what it is not, you can see what it is. It shows the lack of vision in Europe still. There is nothing comparable in Europe, and that maybe also causes skepticism. The Germans are very afraid now of the Chinese, because China last year invested more into Germany than the other way around. The last 30 years, 40 years, Germany really participated, and now they complain that China has not a level playing field, the markets are not open as much as they want, etc. But you see suddenly actually a protectionism. So the skepticism is a way to protect here. And I agree with the member of the European Parliament that some countries will move forward, like Greece, like Spain, like Poland, and many Eastern European, Southern European countries. I think, as the last thought, that this is not the end of liberalism, but it is a new liberalism from I would say, almost from an Asian perspective. To trade, to create markets, to let business flourish, it's a pretty liberal idea, but it is reinterpreted from a Chinese, but also from a Eurasian perspective. And I think that can give hope again also to believe in the next phase of globalization. Some people have called it at the Belt and Road Forum cooperative globalization, which we are now witnessing to emerge. Thank you.
Very much. Very interesting, and I suppose we will continue along this line, because you mentioned neoliberalism end or not end, and actually, judging by what was said yesterday, I suppose we have a very serious background for further discussion on this issue, because neoliberalism does not mean only, the freedom of trade, does not mean only the freedom of exchange or communications, but some unitarialization of the values. And yesterday it was a major problem to discuss. Okay.
Do you allow one more comment on that? No. I think this is the Belt and Road has a really lots of potential. I think, however, the Chinese struggle with one element here. It's on the people-to-people side. Whereas the US could sell freedom, liberalism, individual freedom, if you bring it to a core, and which actually also helped the colonizers in the past to colonize all these countries. It was not just military power, it was not just economic dependency, it was the myth of individual freedom where the colonized imitated the colonizer. And this is a very critical way to see it, right? But this idea, if you go today to the US, you still feel, wow, you can do whatever you want there, and people buy into that. And the question is, what is the Chinese? What is it? Yeah, this is of course, what's the substance? But how does this, how you pick up the people to buy into that? Thank you.